The Compliance Perspectives podcast is sponsored by BlueSight, providing industry-leading privacy monitoring with fast, reliable patient data violation detection. Visit bluesight.com to learn more. Welcome to the Compliance Perspectives podcast. I'm Adam Turtletail from the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics and Healthcare Compliance Association. Joining us today from Scottsdale is Juliette Gust. Juliette is president of Ethics Suite and the author of the chapter Auditing the Confidential Reporting Hotline and Case Management Program Effectiveness in the new Complete Compliance and Ethics Manual. Juliette, thank you for joining us today and for addressing this topic in the manual and in the podcast. So let's start at the beginning. What are the key steps for planning an audit of your helpline and case management system?
Well, thank you for inviting me here and also for the invitation to write this chapter, because it was a great exercise for me, and it's a topic that I certainly feel strongly about and see a lot over and over again with my clients. The first thing I would look for in planning is determining whether there is available data for audit, and this is where a lot of programs see that they might have some shortcomings in terms of the things that they document with regard to allegations they receive into misconduct or theft or fraud. So if you have a helpline or a hotline, how are you tracking the information that comes in? There are many organizations that just have an 800 number, for example, and so that 800 number might go to an HR office, or maybe it goes to a legal office, or maybe it's internal email tracking, and so the only thing that's available is perhaps the allegation that came in, but not necessarily what was done with that allegation. So of course, those organizations that have more sophisticated systems and case management programs that aggregates that data will have more information available for audit. So if that information isn't there, maybe conducting something like a gap analysis is really the first step, so that you can determine, what kind of things should I be looking for? What kind of things should I be tracking? And then once I do that for a certain amount of time, let's say 1 year, then I can start with the audit process. The other thing to look at in planning, of course, is what kind of resources you have to conduct those audits. It's very challenging, for example, if the ethics and compliance program owns the hotline or owns the intake of allegations from any source, are they auditing their own work if they do that? So is there an internal audit function available at the organization that can take that role, or can it be split up in a way that you can make sure that whoever's doing the auditing is impartial and objective? The other thing that I like to look at, and in the article itself, we call it the 3 R's, right? Resources, risks, and regulatory requirements. So under risks, what we want to look for is what is documented and how sensitive is it? So, do I want to be putting certain information in an audit report that maybe should be considered privileged? So I'll have to have discussions with the legal department on what it is I'll be looking at and what it is I may want to document at the end of the audit, to make sure that that information, should there be anything that requires enhancements, not fall into the wrong hands or become public. And then, of course, with the regulatory requirements, now there's additional focus on whistleblower programs, where they would like to be able to see how the organization encouraged the speak up environment and didn't do anything to do the opposite, like chill reporting. So how do you prove that happened, and what kind of data do you have available to be able to prove that happened?
I really like what you said there, and there's one real gem in the middle, which is know what you're looking to find, know what kind of outcome you want. So that way, as you go through the audit, there's a greater sense of purpose to it. Now, there are multiple steps to the audit, which you outline in the article, and we don't have time to go through them all here, but I'm hoping we could highlight a few. I want to start with one area that frankly surprised me. When I think of audits, I think of numbers. You start with auditing tone at the top. How would that audit be conducted?
It is a softer measure, but extremely important. And really anything can be assigned a number. And in some cases, it doesn't even necessarily have to be a number, but still a way to measure progress or measure the state of a certain environment or control. So for example, if you're conducting a special audit, maybe it doesn't involve financial information, you can score it as risk-based. Is it a low-risk issue, a medium issue, high issue? Or could you even use colors like red, yellow, and green to determine For example, I conducted a number of anti-corruption related audits, and of course the results of those are always extremely sensitive, privileged, difficult to communicate without kind of raising some red flags. And so we might use things like red, yellow, and green to determine the state of the environment. Green if anti-corruption audit training was being held regularly, if the right resources are in place, and so on, and maybe yellow if certain policies aren't being followed, and red, of course, if some are being violated or something like that. But for tone at the top, for an auditor, I like to think of it as an entity level control. If you were looking at, say, a SOX type of audit. So the controls that are entity level are really the ones that are designed to ensure management directives for the whole entity are being carried out. And so these could include, for example, if the organization put in an ethics committee, well, how often does that ethics committee meet? Is there a charter for it? Is it following the charter? Are there minutes for those meetings? Are they discussing what they're supposed to? Are the people that are supposed to attend those meetings attending them regularly? And are the agendas for those meetings appropriate? Is the content relevant and so on? So those are things that can be audited to make sure that, for example, that one entity level control of ethics committee meetings held quarterly are being held the way they should. The other things that can be checked that do include numbers are how many people throughout the organization are reviewing the code of conduct and acknowledging it annually. Is there other ethics related training that has to be taken, and was it taken? Was it completed successfully, for example, if there was an assessment? And then, what percentage of the organization in terms of level are taking those trainings? Do 100% of vice president and above ensure that they acknowledge the code of conduct annually and so on? And if that number is low, that could be indicative of leadership not supporting those efforts because they're not making sure that everyone from, let's say, hourly employees all the way up through senior leadership are looking at the code of conduct. Other leadership controls could include my favorite are interviews. And these could be touchy, but I find that after it becomes routine, most people get used to it and they welcome it, especially if it follows a routine pattern. For example, every year you might want to sit with the CEO and the CFO and maybe it's just chief risk officer, chief compliance officer, and ask them the same questions. What is the ethical environment in this organization? And some of those questions are outlined in the chapter, and one, just as example, is does management lead by example? So that's one of the questions that can be asked even of the head of the audit committee so that you can get their thoughts on what's our tone at the top here and how do I feel about others that are my peers at the top.
That's really a great way to think about it. Now, another area that intrigued me was intake and escalation. What should an audit address in these areas?
This is really a wealth of information here because there are so many things that can go wrong in the intake process, starting with who's responsible for the intake process. I've worked with organizations that have people accepting reports and triaging them that have never been trained, have never conducted investigations. They may be perfectly capable as an executive assistant, for example, but they're certainly not trained to identify red flags or to identify issues in terms of, are they related to employee relations issues? Are they related to maybe accounting standards issues? Or could they be related to more serious legal compliance issues? So first is determining who's responsible for the intake. Were they trained? Do they have resources? Are they skilled? And how is that proven? And then, of course, are they independent? Are they impartial? There's organizations that have only one person looking at these issues that come in. And what if the allegation is about that one person? Is there a plan B? Is there a way to restrict someone from seeing a report about them if they were the target of that report? I like to work with clients to determine a kind of central team that has different skill sets as well. Maybe someone's internal audit, someone's legal, someone's ethics and compliance. They could read the same report and get very different information from it. So for example, someone might read a report that was about discrimination or about harassment, but there may be some nuggets in there that had to do with legal issues that are more serious and should be fleshed out during the intake process. Other things I see that really chill reporting are how long it takes to go through that intake process. So for example, if you have a good system that tracks all of these things, a case management system, you can see, for example, a report came in at 4:45 on January 28th, and no one responded to it until April 2nd. That's a problem, right? We want to know how long it takes to triage a new report. Was it immediate? Was a message sent to the reporter even without a lot of information, but just an acknowledgement that says, hey, we got your message, it's important to us, and we're going to investigate it. The other thing you can look at is how long it took to move the case from new to in process, for example, and then to close. But just that escalation point from intake and escalation, how long did it take for me to look at it, determine what's wrong, and escalate it to the appropriate resource for investigation? That's a really good number to have and track, because people know that their reports are either, they'll feel that they're being ignored even if they're not, because they don't know what's going on with it. So responding to them is important. And in some cases, they may very well be being ignored. Maybe it's a lack of resources, maybe it's a lack of training. But if you let these issues fester, what I found is reports that don't get answered pretty quickly, you start to lose employees. They might quit, or they might go to an external agency to report the issue, or they might escalate it in another way that ends up being far more negative than just being able to respond to it quickly. The other is, finally, I'll touch on the need for urgent identification of issues. So if I read a report and I see that there may be a need to separate two employees, maybe I need to put someone on paid suspension or something like that, those are decisions that can be reviewed and assigned numbers to make sure that they were handled appropriately.
So finally today, let's talk about investigations. They're often a challenge for compliance teams. What should the teams be auditing for in their investigations?
There are a lot of points here that can be audited, and of course it depends on the organization, it depends on their resources, it depends on whether they hire third parties as well, but there's always a wealth of things that can be measured here. One could be, is the investigation appropriately scoped? And is it appropriately staffed? Who's doing the investigation? Are they qualified to do the investigation? Are there enough people on the investigation? Did they need maybe subject matter expertise for the investigation and failed to reach out? The other I spoke about earlier, which is reports that aren't responded to at all. So how long did it take to do the investigation and start it? And was the timing of that investigation appropriate? You can also determine if the right parties were notified. So for example, if I need to look at email reviews, I want to make sure that I clear that maybe with the privacy office or with legal counsel. And with IT, do I have the right data preserved? Do I need to send out preservation notices? Did I capture the right data in a form that will make sure there's no spoliation of emails? So all of that can be tracked and measured to see if the steps that were supposed to have been taken for the investigation were taken. Also, was privilege considered? Did I, as an auditor, get really excited about this potential misconduct investigation and, kind of go 100% full speed ahead before considering that everything I did might not be privileged? So I want to put my pencils down first and say, is it important for me to contact legal right now and determine whether this investigation should be conducted under privilege before I take any steps at all? I also want to make sure that I might have to notify different people, like an insurance company. They may have restrictions. You have to notify within 24 or 48 hours if you expect to get any kind of claim for the use of, let's say, forensic accountants or other experts, or for the loss itself, if that is involved. And throughout the investigation, I can test were the right people that were interviewed, were remediation steps appropriate, was disciplinary action consistent, and was it proportionate? And there's a few more that we outline in our chapter, but I think those are kind of the real key ones that you want to look for during the investigation.
Well, Juliette, I want to thank you for taking the time to take us through some of the ways that an audit can be effective when it comes to reporting tools, case management, investigations. I also want to thank you for writing the chapter of the manual. And finally, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen. I'm Adam Turtletaub from SCCE and HCCA. I hope we're able to expand your compliance perspective.